or text. This week we have, for those who don't know, we have a list of the traits. Most of you have them. Should have been front and back. You have those?
No.
Traits, good and bad. If anybody doesn't have them, let me know.
Oh.
There are well over, 230 in there. And then there's this worksheet that you can make copies of. I think I've made it available on the website for you to take off and print so that you can do a daily sort of checklist of how you're doing. This week's focus is going to be on humility. And yes, we all think that we've learned something about humility or think that we've accomplished some level of humility until you get it tested. The soul trait of humility is almost universally taught as the first soul trait because it's fundamental to who we are and it's fundamental to our relationship to God. Humility is absolutely the most important thing to receive Torah. You can't receive Torah in pride and arrogance. And to really define humility is going to be important, but to also understand what's not humility and what potentially could be the challenges of one developing humility in their life. We all know the obvious thing to humility is arrogance, right? The opposite of humility would be arrogance. What would be the opposite of humility, opposite of arrogance? You have arrogance here, you have humility in the middle, that's the optimum. What would be the opposite, Ben?
Oh, the doormat.
Doormat, debased attitude. You let people walk over you. You don't speak up for yourself. That's not humility. That's being a doormat. That's self-debasing. Rabbi Hillel says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? If I'm not now, when? So the point is we do have to look after our own interests. Doesn't mean being a doormat, but also it means that that we develop humility, and there's a way to develop that. You can also find out, do you really have the character traits of humility once you begin to understand what is that what are the descriptions it goes, if you put humility in the middle and think of a continuum. You have humility here, you have arrogance here, and self-debased attitude here. From humility to arrogance, there's a whole line of character traits, negative character traits, that go up into levels, right? And if you begin to examine those negative character traits, you would go, oh, okay, even though in general, I feel like a humble person, I still have to work on some things, and we'll talk about those. Sometimes when we're presented with a challenge, it's difficult to step up and make it happen. It's difficult when we examine the negative character traits, and if you go through this, I would challenge you possibly after this class to go on the negative traits and look for everything negative on the negative traits that would not be humility, that would work against humility. You understand what I'm saying, right? There's, for example, boisterous, number 29. That's the opposite of being humble, right? So the goal of humility as a practice is to find the proper balance of your needs from the needs of others. That means you have to know the needs of others, you have to know your proper needs, and find that delicate balance. The practice has three parts, and we talked about this the other day. All of these character traits that we're going to talk about have three parts. Number one, the mantra, the thing that you're going to say every morning when you wake up. What are you going to do to make a change, okay? It can be as simple as, here's one, no more than my space, no less than my place. Meaning, I'm not going to give in to something to let somebody come walk all over me. At the same time, I recognize my place. I understand what my place in the world. Whatever it may be, you can come up with your own. But you can say, humility is great, but I can't allow people to walk over me. Or, humility is great, I can't do this X, Y, and Z, right? I'll give you a prime example of that. Some time back, a few days ago, I embarrassed someone terribly by something I said, and I didn't mean to do it. And after embarrassing that person, I realized I wasn't being humble at all, right? I thought I had developed humility, but do you realize humility is where you are looking out after another person, right? You prefer another person. So humility is opening the door for somebody when they come in. That's humility. But it's even more humility to not say something even though you think you might be right or justified. It doesn't matter. If you hurt somebody, it's wrong. And it was like it was like one of those things like, I have to really suck it up and fix this, because you just don't realize how you can damage your ability to develop humility. And that's why we're going to go through this in a little bit and do it. Next, after the mantra, you develop it. In the morning, recite the phrase out loud several times. Contemplate the meaning. This will frame your thoughts for the day. Pay attention to the times when your humility comes to play. Now, obviously, we said at the beginning of Mussar, we're not going to focus on the negative, but rather the positive. So look when humility comes to play. When are you able to do it? It's not being humble when somebody abuses you and you don't speak out. That's not humility. Humility is when you know that you need to have been given a lesson and you don't pay attention to it. For example, the police officer pulls you over and it makes you upset and mad because he talks to you a little rough and he gives you a ticket. Well, maybe you need to learn a lesson of humility and take the authority that needs to be done to you. That doesn't mean that I should allow him to abuse me verbally or physically, but at the same time, sometimes you have to be humbled a little bit to be put in check. Next, action. This is the second part of the three-part. If you tend towards too little humility, that is, speak out less and focus on, that means if you tend to lean toward a little humility, speak out less and focus on listening. So it means if you find out you are struggling with that, and that was the area that I really began to realize, is that what happened is in that situation that I embarrassed this person, I should have not spoken. I should have listened. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm embarrassed to have to tell you this in front of everybody, in front of God and my family, but it's the truth. If I would have been humble, I would have been listening, not yakking. Okay, well, we've all done it, but it's still not pleasant when you think that you've refined yourself at some level, and then all of a sudden you've got your shoe in your mouth, and it doesn't taste very good, right? If you tend towards too much humility, speak out more and let your voice be heard, right? Now, let me ask you, is timidity, being timid, humility? No, not at all. Because a person can be timid and a jerk, right? Timid's not humility. So if you're timid, that doesn't give you a break to feel like you're humility. Humility is also being able to speak out and let your voice be heard. Very important. You do not need to do anything dramatic. Just take a small step outside of your comfort zone. What is my small step this week? Is listen more than I speak. Right? Just listen more than I speak. And that's hard when you're a big mouth. Anyway, journaling. Next. We all talked about journaling. Write about your experiences at night before you go to bed. Don't worry about if it sounds challenging. Don't worry about if it's not poetic. Some people are very poetic writers. I'm not. Even if it's some sort of shorthand, that's all right. You only need to practice humility for a week. Now, what do I mean by that? It doesn't mean you drop humility. It's like, ooh, I'm humble now. I don't have to do it anymore. That's not how it works. But what we're saying is, for the purpose of training and self-improvement, we're taking each one of these and intently working on them. God willing, every day after that, you're still living in some level of lesson learned from your week of humility. I like this statement. It says, the truly humble person is not one who feels worthless or inferior. True smallness is what happens when a person stops thinking, what will be with me? What about me? Instead thinks, what is indeed needed for me right now? You see the difference? What about me? What about my situation? And instead they're thinking, what's good for me right now? Because sometimes what's good for us right now may not actually meet what we want. What is at the heart of that fights against humility? Arrogance, right? We talked about ego, right? When our egos get hurt, it's hard to be humble when you're ego in every way, right? So it's really important for us to look at that. The concept that we've heard about a very great prophet is Moshe Rabbeinu. They've said he was the most humble of them all, right? He came from royalty, raised in a royal home, could have been the most arrogant human being ever, but very, very humble. Even in the face-to-face relationship with Hashem, there was that humility. When he met the Creator at the burning bush, he said, you shouldn't send me. I'm challenged. I have too many issues. Why don't you send Mashiach? It would be better, right? Find someone else. Then, of course, Moshe sends, his brother is sent, Aaron sent with him, and they become the dynamic duel of redemption. But instead, what happened, Moshe continues on. He wasn't self-debasing. He was honest with himself. And I think a truly humble person has got to be honest and truthful with himself. An arrogant person refuses to see themselves for who they are. And sometimes to be humbled, you have to be put in the uncomfortable situation to see yourself as you are and recognize it and then make corrections. There was no man, a quote says, no man like Moses ever lived. So just rest your mind at ease. If you think you're ever going to be like Moshe, it's not going to happen. And if you have that expectation of somebody else, it's not going to happen. How could Moses write all of this if he is indeed humble? I mean, you think of all the things that Moshe did, you would think at some level, you'd be like, look what I did. I accomplished all of this. Brought him out of Egypt. He had a big resume. If anybody could have been arrogant, and not arrogant, but just self-confident and maybe a little ego, would have been Moshe, but no. See, the question is based on a misunderstanding of humility. If being humble means thinking of yourself as a good-for-nothing scumbag, then your question is a good one. But that's not humility. That's low self-esteem. You see the difference between the two. Which is the opposite of humility. Truly humble people recognize their own talents and achievements. A truly humble person understands it. So when someone says, you did great on that, what's the name of the guy with the beard on the Rockets? Harden. When Harden says, man, this is one of the greatest games, most three-pointers ever in history, amazing. Harden doesn't go, no, I'm not that good. You don't hear him say that. He knows he's that good. But at the same time, he doesn't seem arrogant either. He doesn't come over like, he's in your face with it. Moses was more humble than any other man on the face of the earth. He was fully aware of the amazing feats that he had achieved. He took the Israelites out of Egypt. He led them to the desert, spoke to God on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. No other human in history had reached such heights. And Moses knew it. Bottom line, he knew it. He even bargained for his life to be written out of the book of life to pardon the people from death. Think about it. If he had bragging rights, that's some bragging rights, right? But he truly believed that this greatness was a divine gift. The greatness wasn't because he was a great person. The greatness was because of the divine gift. And had somebody else been given this opportunity, they would have utilized them better than he did. See, that's a humble man. See, Hashem, if you would have picked somebody else, you wouldn't have been telling them not to go into the Canaan land and that was the end of their reward. See, look at me. I did all this and I still made a mess and couldn't go inherit the land. He would have looked at the simplest of people and think, if he was in my shoes, he would have done a better job than me. Do you see the difference?
You also have the idea that when you've been face to face with the creator of the universe, you become very small.
Very, very small. Right.
Your whole focus is...
I agree. And let's add something to it. That is the case for all of us. And what I mean is look, the only way that a religious person or a righteous person can develop arrogance is when they have been outside of that face-to-face relationship with God. And that is the study of Torah, your perspective on life and perspective of who God is in your life. When you start losing that perspective, that's when your ego comes back. And the more we study, the more we begin to look at God's great attributes and we study his Torah, the more it kind of keeps us in check. It helps us to realize we're not all that. We're not all that special. To see for yourself his worthless, that as worthless is not humility. To see yourself as worthless is not humility. Let me say this again. To see yourself as worthless is not humility. It's horrible for someone to think that they're nothing in the world. They have nothing to contribute in the world. That's just being ungrateful for God giving you the gifts that he's given you. Every one of us has separate gifts. God has blessed each one of us with unique qualities, and we should be aware of that. What is your unique qualities? What do you have that you realize are gifts from God? Some of us wish we had other gifts that other people have, that we don't have. But we should be grateful. In fact, only when we're aware of our self-worth can we be humble. Only when we are truly aware of who we really are. See, a true humble person is not thinking about illusions of grandeur. They're really honest with themselves, very truthful. And I know my place. I know what I can do. I know what I can achieve, and I know what I can't achieve. And to expect myself to achieve something I can't do, it's all right. I can't do it. Let's look for a moment from this quote. Actually, it comes from Rabbi Ben A., who was an anonymous rabbi. As a matter of fact, probably one of the most famous rabbis around. I don't know if you're familiar. Yeah. Rabbi Ben A. He wrote under that hand. We don't even know if his first name was Ben. Using his pen name, Ben A. draws from his personal experience in recovery to incorporate unique Hasidic philosophy into the practice of 12-step program, right? The whole 12 steps. So he gives this quote, Genesis 21:33. He says, Abraham planted an orchard in Beersheba, and there called out in the name of the Lord. Seems a little indescript. But he says this, after discovering the truth about the one God as a child, Abraham spent the rest of his life spreading the message of monotheism throughout the world. One of his tactics was, as described in this week's portion, in the, I think it was Vayechanan, right? I think it's that portion last week. But in the Torah portion where he says, where he spreads monotheism throughout the world, one of the basic tactics was described as is that would one establish himself in a barren spot in the desert, set up a tent, create a lodging place for travelers, wherever people would pass by, and would invite them in and lavish them with fine delicacies and eats. Let them rest for a while. Now, interesting thing, he'd find a barren place, like where there's no Motel 6, there's no gas stations, there's no other one of those big 18-wheeler places to pull into. He was the only thing going, so they had to stop there. And there he would lavish them with great meals, and when his guests would thank him, Abraham would tell them not to thank him, but to bless him whose food you have eaten. Bless the one who's given you the food. Sometimes it would happen that guests would refuse to recite the prayer of thanks, in which case Abraham would then present the guest with an exorbitant bill and demand payment for the meal. This comes from the Midrashim. When unable to pay, the guest would agree to thank God. The question is, why did Abraham bother to coerce stubborn guests to recite this prayer? If they did not believe, then his pressuring them would only succeed in extracting outward compliance, not genuine devotion. What was the value of forcing his guests to play lip service to God and their belief in God, after all? It was insincere. After this, Abraham was not interested in his gift fraying in a belief in God. He sought to and succeeded in bringing them to a genuine faith. What Abraham realized is that when a person puts up a wall against God, it is a sign of a coarse and a rigid ego. After granting the person's hospitality and speaking so convincingly about his belief, only a person consumed by arrogance and self-reliance would be so stubborn as to refuse to acknowledge God, but by offering thanks for his food. Accordingly, Abraham would cast such a person into a predicament, if not being able to pay for his meal in order to break down this willful pride. The ego had been tactically crushed and and the obstacle of faith was removed. So the whole purpose Abraham had was, I'm going to break this guy down to a place of humility to where he has to acknowledge he's not all that, and that there is something greater than himself, which I find it pretty interesting. So the lesson to us is not that we need to bring about a state of helplessness in others in order to lead them to become more open into pursuing a relationship with God. Such maneuvers are are the right of spiritual giants. But for us, we don't get into cajoling people and proselytizing people. What we can take from this is to apply this principle to ourselves and realize our sensitivity to God is inversely proportional to the degree of our feelings of self-reliance. The more prideful and sure of ourselves we are, the less open we are to God. The more humble and more circumspect we are, the more open we are in our relationship with God. Many of us believe in God long before coming to a place of what do you call it, study and closeness to God in religion. Many people believe in God. There's a lot of people out there who are not even religious at all. But until that person begins to understand who they are, as you said, how small they are in reference to the creator of the universe, only then can you really begin the steps of becoming that person who is a humble person. So, what my challenge would be to take this and get a highlighter, and this week, as you work on your humility quotient, go through and look what would be counterproductive to your operation in humility, right? And I'll just kind of go through a couple. I'm gonna just read a couple, and you'll see what I'm saying. How about number one, abrasive? You think that's opposite of humility? Yes. Abrupt, that's me. Absent-minded.
You think that would be it?
Absent-minded?
Absent-minded.
Well, this is what, well, there's a difference between being 55 or older and not remembering things, okay? So that's one thing. The absent-minded they're talking about is you're not thinking of others.
Oh, okay, so yeah.
Right, you just never think of other people. Men have this greater problem than I think women do. You guys are more intuitive about the needs of other people, and men are just not that way. We have to practice that.
Enough.
Do what?
Sensitive enough.
Right. We're not sensitive enough to recognize that. It's like a lot of times my wife will ask me, says, hey, I just get off the phone with one of my boys and say, hey, well, how did he feel about X, Y, Z? And I'm like, don't know. I didn't ask him, man. Because guys, we don't think about how you felt about something. We just, did you do it or not? Right, y'all? You've had that conversation before? We said aggressive. How about aloof? Antagonistic. That's another good one. Argumentative. Ooh, here's a good one. Attention seeking.
What are the highlighted ones for?
Huh?
What are the-
Oh, those are the 13. Oh, here are the 13 attributes. I'm sorry. Here are the key.
She's asking the bold.
Yeah, what they call the key Mussar words, and all the lowercase or lightened ones are the other adjectives that describe many of those attributes.
So they're like, they're the main headings.
The main headings, correct.
And like those are all the ways to be
What was the alphabetical?
No, it's not all the way to be anger. What it is anger is, if you were to look just at the basic elements of the good traits and bad traits, those are the ones that are listed in bold. The rest of them are other adjectives that sort of fit in between all those areas. Cheater. I could see a lot of them that we could probably debate on. Can you guys pick out something that you see in there? Feel free to bring it up.
That relates to us?
Yeah, no, not to yourself. No, we're not wanting you to talk about yourself. I'm talking about, that would make an interesting class. That would make an interesting class. We're just talking in general, hypothetically, someone who was not humble, this would be a challenge for them if they were this way.
Well, obviously 28, both boastful.
Boastful, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Arrogant actually isn't on there.
it's arrogant. No, it's not, is it?
How about this?
Do what?
I was looking at that. Yeah, I'm looking at it. Bullying.
Yep.
Argumentative.
Callous and careless.
Cold-hearted.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, this really doesn't have anything to do with humility, but number 47, why would clumsy be considered a negative trait? Maybe you just can't talk it. You're just clumsy. Why would that be? And maybe you can't do anything about that. I don't get that. What's it actually referring to?
I think it's referring to not as a person who's vertically challenged, right? That they have a problem, they maybe trip or vertigo issues. It's talking about someone who hasn't put thought about what they do, and they just do clumsy things.
Or see.
Do what?
Or see.
Or say clumsy things. They just do things.
And left
What-
it effect. It's the,
Like, oh, well, that's who I am, huh?
Awkward, kind of awkward.
Yeah, the awkward kind of thing that they don't really think about the situation they're in, the environment they're in, what's happening around them, and they just do clumsy things. That now, it doesn't have anything to do with humility, but it's not a positive trait to be a clumsy individual that doesn't think very clearly about what they're doing. And that's why we say no issue. I'm not talking about Michael because it's other teenagers. But teenagers can be very clumsy. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like when you ask them, why did you do that? And they go, well, I don't know.
Mm.
They really don't know why they did it. It's just, right? They don't know. I remember my middle boy, Michael, threw a military grade smoke grenade down our chimney. Remember that? We were all gone. We just came home and all the windows and doors were open. I'm like, what was this going? What happened? And so Mike, I don't think he told us at the time, right? It was only later, like after they're married, he told me, I said, remember the time the house was all open, doors were open? I said, yeah. He said, well, I was on the roof playing like I was a soldier and that was a bunker. And I pulled that big old can of smoke and it's like military, threw it down the chimney and it rolled out onto the floor of the house. And I'm surprised it didn't burn the house down. And he said, there was smoke all in the house. And so I said, Michael, why did you do that? He goes, honestly, at the time, I didn't think. Right? You're just clumsy. You don't think about it. That's the negative trait. Good part.
How about controlling?
Controlling? Oh, yeah. Cranky.
Cranky, yeah.
Critical.
Cool.
It's interesting that fearful is on here. 'Cause that is a negative.
That is a negative trait, to be fearful, yeah. Demanding. Domineering. Devious. There's a lot of these fit into that category. It lacks. So anyway, you guys can go through this, make you a list. If you want to follow this thing here to work on humility, which is the one, it's down here a little bit close, Havana, down at the bottom. You can fill that out and tell you how you do. Yes.